From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm excited that we're in our new office.
Yep.
People who are watching might be able to look at our background and see that we didn't actually take any reference photos to make sure that it looked the same in terms of the positioning of things.
Continuity, schmontinuity.
Yeah, that's
is what
it.
I say.
Who cares? Not me. So, yeah, nice to be in the new space.
Yeah. So it's more right size for us. We didn't need 400 square metres for half a dozen people.
Arguably, we never needed 400 square metres.
Yeah, but there was good rates to be had after COVID. So
Absolutely.
No, the size of the office is the right size for the people that we have in the team in Perth that like coming into the office.
Yep. The location is nicer, although the people on the freeway driving between 80 and 90 kilometres when the limit is 100 is not something I had to deal with at the last place.
But the reason we came here, Joelle, is so that you can take public transport, and now you're choosing to drive still.
Well, you know, I do have other commitments and things outside of work that sometimes is better for me to have a car from work so that I can be sure to get to them.
Fair enough. Well, luckily we got you a car bay anyway, even though you said you're going to be on the train.
I will. I was thinking about it tomorrow, but I've got a physio appointment in the morning, so it'll maybe be next week that I will start taking the train sometimes.
One day. Rhiannon was so excited to be on the train. She didn't even have to come in on Monday because we didn't have the internet set up, and she decided to still catch the train because she was so excited to catch the train, and then hotspotted to be able to be in the office.
Was she really excited to catch the train, or were there other reasons that she came in?
No, I think she was really excited. She didn't have to be here. She could have worked from home. She works from home 3 days a week.
Yeah.
So she's just very excited to be on the train. Anyway, one day, Joelle, maybe you'll do it. Maybe we'll put that on the podcast as well.
Don't know that I'll be excited to be on the train, Jason.
We're still waiting for you to use your e-bike, so it might be easier access now down the freeway.
I'll still have to carry it up the stairs, though. It's too heavy for me to carry up the stairs.
Just your excuses.
Yes, physics schmizics.
Yeah, that's right. Don't you go to the Pilates for core strength so you can lift like electronic scooters up stairwells?
That's exactly why I go to Pilates, yeah.
So you're saying it's just a matter of time before you build up the core strength to be able to do it?
No.
Okay, we'll watch
It's not just core strength, it's like arm and shoulder strength.
Okay, we'll watch this space.
I'm not lifting with my abs.
You're doing it wrong. All right. Well, look, let's introduce our guest.
Stop wasting time.
Yeah. We have said we need to do this in an hour today.
Yeah.
He was actually the very first guest of this podcast. We had a mystery guest, the first one, which actually just ended up being
Yeah, it was me.
Joelle.
It doesn't count as being a guest.
Yeah, most were disappointed. But he was the first real guest. He appeared on episode 2 in February 2021. He leads investment governance and stewardship within a natural resources portfolio in Australia and New Zealand, spanning agriculture, horticulture, and post-farm gate assets. His work sits at the intersection of board governance, responsible investment integration, non-financial risk frameworks, and portfolio-level operational oversight. Yes, he's more intelligent than us.
Combined.
Yeah. Welcome back to the podcast, Wade Needham.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you back on again, mate. How you been?
Very well. Very, very busy, as everyone always says. But recently have been actually getting back into some writing. So that's been really nice to be able to share some thoughts. But yeah, it's been, pace of change at the moment is amazing. So I don't think anyone that says they're not busy, they're lying, or have won lotto, right?
Yeah, this is true. But yeah, it's been nice seeing some of your posts up on LinkedIn again. I did miss that. And it was one of your LinkedIn posts in particular that led us to the topic of today, which we'll get to in a moment.
Before we get into that, Wade, do you have any time to listen to podcasts lately? And if so, what are you listening to?
I'm a horrible person. I actually don't do podcasts. I used to, but now my preference is actually reading the transcript and putting in music. Typically, not music, but typically orchestral stuff. So Hans Zimmer, Enualdi, those sort of guys, and like really trying to read, think, and then take that further. So yeah, podcasts. I'm not doing a lot of driving on the freeway at these stages, so haven't really got back into podcasts, but still love transcripts. So people that do that at their podcast, thank you very much.
Any in particular that you're reading then?
Not particularly. Typically at the moment, there's a fair bit of geopolitical disruption happening. And luckily enough, there's a number of high quality judgments that have come out. So, reading legal cases at the moment, some new frameworks that are coming out from an investment non-financial side of things. And even today, like a new human rights, paper dropped around how migrants are treated in Australia. So because across a fair bit of scope from the non-financial space, there's typically something that someone's put out that's really interesting. And then the thought goes to quickly, how do you execute against it and integrate it to what you're doing? So that sounds horribly boring, but yeah, that's, I have fun. I genuinely enjoy it.
You bring in that big brain energy.
Yeah. Like I generally like trying to connect things. Like that's the good part of it. But just podcasts haven't really got back into it.
We'll allow it.
No, Wade and Kevin Jones were the two guys that were really on me about getting transcripts for our podcast. And back in the day, you had to actually get people to do it manually. Now AI does it, so we probably could add a transcript. So.
I mean, AI does it kind of poorly though. Like the AI on this platform always calls you Jason Banshee.
Yeah.
You do tend to shriek outside of people's homes in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I mean, I have been called worse.
Yeah.
By people in this room, but yeah.
I would say give transcribing another go. It's things are moving very quickly.
I guess elevator pitch of what you've been up to since we last talked to you, because otherwise it could be a very long.
Yeah, hugely. And interesting enough, when I got back into reading, I went back over some of the old posts I wrote in like 2016, 2017. So great cringe moments, but also like, okay, yeah, my thinking's upgraded from then. Like, oh, that's interesting. I thought that. Like, so like at the moment, it is really around what I'm working on right now. Really, it's around how do you translate noise from signal, but also integrating. There's increasing societal expectations around what businesses need to deliver. There's different geopolitical events happening at the moment, and then central to that is also there is little niches of risk that are sort of popping up, and all are important. But there's how do you fit and continue to fit different niche risks into an operating business without overwhelming it. But at the same time meeting both societal, shareholder, and worker and union expectations. So to me, it's really around how do we work better and integrate better into that process and still allow people to do what they want to do, which is come to work and be impactful every day. So we're not here to come and do compliance. At the moment, there's a lot of focus on, for example, how the intersection between work health and safety, psychosocial safety, fair work compliance and migrant workers, for example, how that all connects in, but also around, involved a lot of mergers and acquisitions, how to do that and continue to do that really well, and also help scale agri businesses that are within Australia and globally. So yeah, it's a lot of great work, but never boring, never dull.
So are you suggesting that there is a way to do mergers and acquisitions well, Wade?
Well, yeah, a lot of the research for finance is pretty poor, but yeah, I mean, especially in relation to how do you get a good picture as to what you're inheriting should the deal go ahead, and how does that connect in, and then what is material to both sides of the transaction, and what's important to that process, and then how do you get it? How do you get that information? So and do it in an economical way. So I definitely think it's one of the areas that it probably isn't focused on from a safety perspective, but businesses change hands all the time. We know demographics are changing very soon in the next 10 to 20 years, and there'll be a large transfer of business ownership. And we've seen, businesses typically get bigger over these days. The acquisitions of the large retailers, getting more into vertical integration. So, I think a lot more of how those bigger parent entities are acting in relation to subsidiaries and joint ventures, I think it's always been of interest to me. And I just can't get continuous improvement out of my blood.
Nice one, mate. Well, yeah, as you were saying, you have been writing more, and some of that's been appearing on LinkedIn. Like you said, there's been some high quality legal judgments that you've been going through. And that intersection of those two things is what kind of made me reach out to you and try and get you back on the podcast again. So you're joining us today to talk about officer due diligence following a recent New Zealand High Court ruling. So can you, for our listeners, maybe just lay out a bit about the ruling?
Yeah, so two things. One is in New Zealand. So if you're in Australia or other Commonwealth countries, great. You've got a fantastic case to read. And definitely don't just listen to me on this. I think it is really worthwhile sitting down and reviewing the judgment, even though they're quite lengthy. So two does extend to a few pages. But in effect, there was a case, Maritime New Zealand versus Gibson. That was from December 2024. And then there was an appeal, Gibson versus Maritime New Zealand in March 2026. So, and what that's really really allowed is it was a high quality judgment with was an exceedingly sad tragedy associated with the worker that passed away. A lot of really great learnings for how regulators are progressing prosecutions. But also it dispelled a lot of common myths that I think exist in both the director and officer cohort, and touched upon a lot of things that a lot of people I think see day to day, and it gave a really causal pathway for people to go, hey, this is happening in my business. Hey, senior leaders, you should read this, and do you see the same signals? So to me, I love judgments like this that are rich, that judges really put thoughts into the judgments they're putting, very quotable, but also I think it helps elevate people's ability to influence others, and legal judgments always do that because typically officer and directors are tend to be motivated, in this area by compliance still. So to me, it's fantastic to have such a high quality judgment come out of New Zealand, very close to us, and sort of be also shared and discussed in the ecosystem. So. Yeah, so that I think it's great to chat about that today, but also around, I think there's also some conversations around what the judgment actually means and how far you can extrapolate it out, and what people should take from it. So I started reading it, it was quite lengthy. I said, well, I might as well start taking some notes, and then that sort of led, and that's why I also encourage other people to do is, as you're reading, take notes, integrate into your own practice, but also share it with people in your circle to be able to then, broaden the impact of what happened.
Yeah, and there's definitely a number of people sharing their insights about the judgment. But yeah, we'll be unpacking it with you today. Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about what was he charged with and kind of what were the broad findings?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the injured worker the worker that passed away, it was associated with a falling container, and in effect a barrier process, making sure that somebody couldn't walk into a area where a container could fall on someone. So the case was quite robust because it actually looked at, from an officer perspective, what was the lead up to that case and what was the indications, but it also looked at, from a reasonable perspective, what could have been done. And one of the really interesting parts that could have been done is that whilst there was no technological solution at the time that could solve the problem, there was a lot of indicators that were able to be relied upon that weren't either followed up from an independent audit. There wasn't interim controls put in place that could have been done around preventing people from going into the area or signalling that was a drop zone. But also around there was in that site as well, there were multiple prior fatalities as well. So when you compound all of those together, you can understand why the regulator brought the case. You can also understand and really interestingly see the insight from the board chair, who was quite complimentary of their assessment of the CEO's performance. And also around employees' views around the CEO's performance and that he was a good guy. So it wasn't a classic villain case of a bad corporate or a bad person, but it was really good to unpack that. So that's why I say it's such a rich judgment, because it really does reflect not a really narrow technical view of what happened, but a broad situation that I think a lot of people can apply to their own context.
Yeah, so in terms of the appeal, the court rejected his reliance on his but he was basically saying that he trusted the competence of his subordinates and the systems that he had in place, and they rejected his reliance on that. Now, obviously, this was around safety controls, but if we were to think about that reasoning in relation to psychosocial risk, like what implications does that have for Australian organisations in particular?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. One of the things that I picked it as part of it was around, typically we rely upon experts to tell us what we should be doing. But there's also an expectation around how we should be checking to make sure those things are in place. And one of the areas where my thinking is sort of lifting from who should own psychosocial risk management is actually around, you have typically two functions that do things in this space. And often a lot of the work that the people function does or HR function does is around first order or first line controls, around supporting management as to how they do that. So my upgraded way of thinking now is around, yes, you have to then ask the people that are delivering the control, is it effective, is it working, and is it resourced? But there's also a need from an assurance layer, what's the second line function? And so to me now, my thinking is upgraded where WHS can be that second line of assurance as to say, is the primary line of management and the people activities that are protecting against risks that are occurring, how can that actually happen? So to me, in physical safety, we wouldn't let an operations team audit itself. We typically would rely upon a safety team to audit that as second line. So to me, it's blurring the lines between management, HR as first line, WHS as second line, and then you have your external audit or independence as sort of third line of defence. So that to me is a really interesting one. But also the old engagement survey being treated as exposure measurement when it's really a sentiment type of things, unless it's been well designed, and likely around EAP as well, and complaint channels. So to me as well, like this is a good judgment because it had an audit completed that had actions that wasn't being followed up, but also there was reliance upon the data that was coming through to the CEO, and around how that was actioning and how that he was interpreting that information coming through and what should he do on behalf of that. So yeah, like I said, really rich, fantastic to think through, between what happened and then how does that apply to both in Australia, but also different risk segments.
So you mentioned engagement scores and EAP. If you think about those things and other metrics like turnover, they're often the triffer of psychosocial safety, right? They're really lag indicators. So what is the equivalent of a critical control inspection outcome for a psychosocial hazard, do you think?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit outspoken on this, but I actually think it's more financial metrics. So like the causal chain to me typically happens around, and I suppose I come at this from two factors, is that people sometimes do bad things to each other, okay? But also there's around, well, what's the organisation doing? So typically I see the culpability more of the organisational pressure or the resources that aren't being applied to allow people to do great work or causing them harm. So to me, the chain sort of runs like commercial pressure hits, margin squeeze occurs, growth targets aren't met, or they are met because contracts are won without the capacity and the people being able to deliver them, or the capability within them. We then have challenging resourcing of those things, hiring freezes, understaffing, delaying the backfill of those resources, and then we have either a contract over-reliance or a workload distribution problem. And then you have role creep, time to competence, all those things sort of compound. And that's how I see the causal pathway sort of existing, and why that more and more people are under pressure to deliver is typically from the financial expectations upon management teams. So I think if you don't have that lens, it actually points itself towards the more individual level controls, but also around putting an over-reliance upon what a team leader can do in a situation where commercial pressures are driving the organisational pressures on that team leader. So to me, I actually think when we think of critical controls, I actually don't look straight to, is the person trained? I look more to around, well, okay, does that leader have the right amount of people in his team, or her team? Does that person have the right level of skills within that team? Are they actually hitting their performance or what they need to do? And if they're not, what's the business's normal way to course correct? Is that typically piling more pressure on? Is it allowing people to grow, thrive, and those sort of things? But it's actually around how we how work occurs, but also around how commercial pressures drive how work is structured.
Yeah, that really stuck out for me when you were having that conversation with Chris Jones at PHSCon last year, how you can actually foresee these psychosocial hazards starting to emerge 2 years out if you look at budget and forecasting. And if you've got a budget that hasn't actually planned for enough growth and then the resources to support that, then you're going to have work overload issues and then all the other kind of negative behaviours that are often associated with that.
Yeah, and often it's not the business's problem, right? It's not the big bad shareholder. It can be, geopolitical activities that are occurring right now, which causes either price increases or, inflation to input costs, right? Then the margin has to come from somewhere. So where is the extra gear? So to me, it's not a black and white, who's bad, who's not, but it's around how the business responds to the pressure being put on it and what are the levers it can use. And typically often it's a distribution onto the individual rather than thinking how can the organization respond. So when you're looking at critical controls, you're going in physically looking at something in field. To me, it's sometimes from a psychosocial perspective, it's around how can the team and the people above that distribute the load equally as to who can handle that load. That doesn't mean someone more resilient, by the way, but that means, can I push certain activities? Can I, suck up a margin push here to be able to catch it somewhere else? So there's always levers you can pull, but it's around how you distribute that around, spend, for example. If you don't want to cut back your team size, so then I can defer some capex to a point where it becomes a problem. I might give myself a 3-month window. So they're the sort of things that I think that the questions should be put to people as to how does that exist. And that's just a different conversation I think that people want to have, but often the economics seems to be a dirty thing as to, oh no, we don't want to talk about that. We'd rather talk about, well, is the EAP hitting the box? Are people trained? Did the mental health first aider, step in and do this? Like that sort of level, I think, is more where most people's brains at right now.
Yeah, and finances and budget is one thing, but what you're really talking about here is what are escalation factors that could amplify the impact of an existing psychosocial hazard. So in most workplaces, work overload is always a possibility to occur, right? And if you're an organisation or an executive team that's operating with a high risk tolerance and saying, hey, we're actually going to push people to their limits, and then something happens, like you say, geopolitical uncertainty and destabilisation, price increases. We had COVID, right, which put huge like uncertainty into the community, and a lot of frontline workers in retail environments are really bearing the brunt of that, uncertainty or stress that the community was feeling through additional violence and aggression. So you've got that underlying psychosocial hazard, and you're really operating as business as usual to the limit of, say, work overload. And then you have this thrown in, now we have less money to spend and we have to do it with less headcount, or we have, a COVID-19 and, community stress and aggressiveness goes up. And so now we've got these additional pressures on people, which, ultimately is more likely to harm them.
Yeah. And it's not having a judgment based upon it. It's about calling out the factor and going, well, where's the load going to be redistributed? And typically you can't have that conversation till you escalate past the point of where we're used to being the team management perspective. We need to get out of the team and get into the group or to the business unit as to like who can pull those levers. And they typically have the delegations of authority to be able to change span of control. And span of control typically, as I think where most people should be focused on right now, is around that span of control can flex depending on how many resources you need, because you can bring in more resources if you have a newer team because they're not as skilled, for example. So, or you can supplant with contractors, all those sort of things. But the span of control to me is often where we need to really look hard. And then secondly, are people using the escalation channels around, we don't want the report when people are sexually harassing people. We want the report for indecent, verbal discussion, right? Like, so we want a class 3 being reported versus waiting for that person and allowing that person to do it 3 or 4 times till they escalate to a class 1 behavior. So that's the other thing for me is to like, are your pathways working? And then what are you doing based upon it to try and get up the causal chain? That's a good one to me, is to ask people as to where do you think and where do you want to catch it? Because often people want to catch it early, but their systems are designed to are they building fences at the top of the cliff, or are they resourcing the ambulance at the bottom? And when you put it to people like that, typically it's around, we're waiting for them to fall.
Yeah.
So then we've also got Respect at Work. So we had revisions to the Sex Discrimination Act a couple of years back now, and that creates that positive duty to prevent sexual harassment, not to just have actions in place after it's been reported. So how does that interact with the Section 27 WHS officer duties? And in particular, where do you see the first test case of this coming from?
Yeah. So they're interestingly enough, the common cause is officers and directors, right? But in effect, they're drafted differently, they're enforced differently, but single leaders need to know both. And that is that complexity I'm talking about here, is around if you take it from each legal instrument, people have to then create a working model in their head, when rather than say, well, hold on, I've got our leader's handbook here as to like, this is how I do my job well. This is how I do my job well over this amount of span of control, and this is what does good look like. So to me, it actually is contingent upon organisations to understand this complexity, work with external legal counsel or whoever you've got internally in your team to actually say, how do I help people to see what they need to do, not what they need to not do. So to me, the interesting one for this is around, theoretically, you can discharge your WHS due diligence, but breach your positive duty. And those sort of situations get up. Now, people like myself and lawyers and others are really technical, you zoom down in on that. But genuinely, most people just want to understand, well, how do I don't fall foul of this? So, look, the first test case to me is typically will require upon someone who's legally represented. And we're seeing this more and more, both from people who are legally represented but not. When claims are coming to businesses, they're typically taking 3 or 4 different avenues based upon a single event. So there might be a workers' compensation claim, there might be a human rights angle, there might be a WorkSafe angle, and there might be a Fair Work angle. So that can happen more and more, but also what we're seeing is around, with the rise of large language models, typically it's around, they can be used both as a great literacy tool to help people understand, the things that they should be experiencing at work, but they can also be used for those things to democratize access to justice and courts. So to me, I think it's going to come largely from probably a professional services firm, hospitality, resources, those sectors that typically have had some negative press in the past, and regulators looking to make a stand, and 2 regulators working together. Federally and state, it's always hard, but they don't act together. They're acting independently of each other. So I don't think 2 regulators are going to come together and gang up and say, yeah, we're going to both go this. But I think naturally it will happen over time, as more of the coordination, cooperation happens, but also they're learning at the same time as well. So to me, it doesn't always mean that you're going to have 2 prosecutions, but you're going to have 2 regulators typically acting in the same space. And one response may look differently to the other. But yeah, I think the best thing you can do in this area is really map what does that positive duty look like, and how does that connect into the WHS assurance. And then designing really well to make sure leaders don't just know what they shouldn't do, but what they should do and what they should do well, and get them to focus on that.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities, or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
Yep, good points there. And I think, definitely the more that the businesses can get across the requirements of both within kind of the one process, I guess, is definitely going to help simplify things for them.
Yeah, definitely needs to be more or better guidance. Like you say, Wade, it's, these two regulators are coming at it from different angles, and there's a lot of overlap. And in fact, the Respect at Work actually took a direct copy and paste, didn't they, from the Model Act?
In relation to severity, frequency, impact of sexual harassment. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like they don't know what each other is doing, but they need that consolidated approach. It'd be great to see a proper case tried, like you say, and create that legal precedent. Now, you mentioned before, Wade, that you sit on the investor side of the table, which is really unique for a safety person. So when you diligence a portfolio's company's psychosocial risk posture, I'm assuming that you do. What are you actually looking at?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, two main thrusts here. One is sometimes there's a legal compliance angle, definitely, as to how is an existing management team or business satisfying their legal needs. But second is a materiality, as around what's the exposure of that business and what does the investor care about. So one of the areas which is growing globally, and I've spoken about this a little bit, is around the rise of sort of human rights. Because that's a global topic. Compliance at a WHS or a safety typically is a country by country and often state by state level. So human rights typically encaptures things like, making sure freedom of association, making sure people are paid right. WHS is now under the ILO, human rights. So it's a broader umbrella as to employment. So that's definitely an area of really importance, and how human rights is translating through supply chains. So that's the other thing to look at. It's not just a business when you're purchasing it. You're looking at, well, how do they interact in the supply chain, and what is the revenue that's generated from that supply chain as well. So you can purchase a fantastic business, but if the businesses that is supplying that businesses may fall foul of retailer, for example, or other customer needs, you've got a challenge. So it's interesting in the fact of this is done at both a business level that you're looking to acquire, but actually what is the supply chain and what's that level of assurance over that as well. So the standard approach is typically mapping the capability, capacity, and strength of the systems, but also around reviewing board papers. So what's the level of information that the management team is getting? Are you seeing information coming through? Are you seeing briefings? What's the level of reporting? Is there connection between functions? So that is really rich insights, and then sitting down with people. And one of the good parts of due diligence is that typically when you're undertaking it, you're working with external advisors that are experts in their field. They're undertaking this, but which allows you as a practitioner to sit back and sort of piece some dots together. So whilst you might be on site doing an inspection or looking at something, you also can sit down, and often I've sat into like lunchrooms as part of due diligence processes and actually looked at the workforce. Now, often you don't talk to the workforce. That's a big challenge. So it's hard to get that. But, are people arriving happy? Are they happy to have lunch? Are they engaging with each other? What's the level of, are they happy to get out the door when they arrive to work? Are they smiling? Like all of that sort of stuff is really important, that are often things that, don't just are a line item and a tick box. So they're a bit of how they feel. So, but one of the great things I like doing when you're assessing anything, even if it's a new business or a new job, is when you walk in, you go, well, okay, what was the existing level of reporting? And then, based upon my worldview, like and others' worldview, well, how do I, for example, take the LTIFR or TRIFR rate and then compare that to the workers' comp rate? And then if I take that, how do I look at the turnover rate and the absenteeism rate? And then you get a picture very quickly around what do the businesses care about and what do they tolerate? Because if you're showing 12 or 24 months of the same performance, it's pretty clear that's the level of performance that's tolerated. And so I think seeing that type of data, sometimes it can frustrate you, like, oh, wow, this could be better. But then, when you're looking to purchase a business, you're also looking for upside to say, wow, hey, did you guys know that you're 2 or 3 times the workers' comp rate in this industry? Oh, no, we didn't know that. And then you're like, well, okay, well, hey, where should the bar sit? So you have some great conversations with people, and often people are doing fantastic and the best they can, but they just are running the business so hard and doing what they need to do that they often don't have that external perspective as well. So yeah, to me, going through from a due diligence perspective is great because you get to assess, you get to talk to people, you get to validate some of the things that your mental models you have. But also, if the transaction goes ahead, it presents a great window for then how does that business integrate with the business that's purchasing it, or how much opportunity is on the table, and wow, look at where we can go from this. As to like how many more people can I impact now through a better way of working.
Yeah, and I'd imagine those insights that you can given that you're across so many portfolio companies in agriculture, around like what does normal performance actually look like, and trying to get assessed from them whether there's an appetite to improve. I think that would be invaluable.
Yeah, and often when businesses are selling themselves, they're putting the best foot forward, right? So it's also great to get the romance view of the world, but the data doesn't lie, right? And that's where you dig into the data, you have the conversations, you're validating, you're triangulating, but often the information you're getting, like that reporting, sometimes isn't as deep as what you would like. So then you need to go and find the proxies or the better information where it comes from. So, for example, if you are looking at LTIFR or TRIFR, that's why you compare it to workers' comp. That's why you take the workers' comp and compare it to absenteeism. That's why you go and do the legal reviews as to are there any prosecutions for that business. So to me, there's no one thing you need to look at. It's really around triangulating and then working with other due diligence streams from an asset management. So is CapEx being put into the business as the level it should? Is the split between contractors and workforce right? All those sort of things are things you need to come into. But it is, when you look at due diligence, is fantastic because you get to look at the whole business. And often what I see is when you really ask people around, hey, how much do you engage in your business? Typically, most people never see the board sections of anyone else's other than their own. And they might only have 2 or 3 paragraphs. So typically, like at a C-suite level, you might see it all, or maybe the board might see it all. And that's, I think, another way where public market annual reporting is such a rich source for practitioners who work in a specific function to elevate their understanding as to how do things connect through and what does public markets need. So that to me is where you fit and what are the drivers of things in the business. Having that understanding makes you incredibly more valuable and then able to solve more problems and be able to generate more impact.
Yeah, as you say, it's not just compliance for compliance sake, but how do we help the organisation to meet its goals, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the point, is to going, hey, if there's an indicator in due diligence, you then can bake into the model, hey, I think there's some upside here with a little bit of investment. So and then you can put in some new processes. So if they're not doing early engagement of injured workers or not putting, additional training in place, or they're not looking at span of control, like all those sort of things you can start to look at. So that's where you can add really a lot of value, is if you understand the commercial impact on what you can advise, you can then price that into the value that you can add over the next period of time. And that's just not a straight commercial argument to say, we'll make the shareholders more money. No, it's actually, and a lot of the investments that we've made, people have come in and gone, this is fantastic. We didn't have access to doctors and early engagement. I could never get an appointment at the local physio in a rural town because they're always booked up. Well, now I can get access to a video straight away when there's a strain versus waiting and I've got to go to the emergency department, right? What's a job dictionary? Like, what's a health hygiene exposure? Psychosocial, what is this? So it's all this stuff that you can bring, but it's hard when you're in a going concern business to sometimes eke out that improvement and generate that ROI where you get that you can do at either a due diligence point in time, an acquisition, or even a new construction or something like that. So those key points where, like sliding doors, you have this real ability to generate more impact because everything is being looked at and opened back up.
Well, so let's talk about then what an officer's psychosocial due diligence file should look like, Wade, and how might that be different from what most boards are seeing today?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. The first thing that most people don't get is around, typically it sits in functional silos, and as a director you've got to like worm your way through the pack and try and find how does it all connect. So to me, it's really interesting to actually ask this question back to management and say, no, I don't want a function to give me a paper, but how would the whole of management describe this and be able to articulate this in a cohesive narrative across different functions, but also how it actually helps the objectives of the business. So to me, it's not about having a very static risk register or a bow tie that's like, here's how everything works. Because that's the work as imagined, right? Oh, yeah, people should not feel good. Then they, speak to their manager. Then they go to the EAP. And then, it doesn't happen in a linear causal way. So to me, that is really interesting. But also from an exposure perspective, that concept of either vulnerable groups or people that are more predisposed to exposure. How am I having a line of sight? It's that to be able to segment my workforce. And then where should I be spending my time on focusing on that? So, younger workers, workers which are exposed to risks which can't be designed out. So those are in healthcare or with the public or, working in prisons, like I've had that exposure before. So it's challenging those things. But to me, it's really around that second point, and I raised this earlier, is around you can ask that as well, but ask the question as to what does the design look like, but what does the assurance look like? So as a director and officer, you're not the expert, right? You engage people like you guys to come in and say that. But also, how do you set it up in your own business so you don't have, you're not like the Gibson case, you're not relying upon one expert, but you've actually built in, here's what management should do. Here's what, the people function should do. Here's what WHS is making sure those two are doing what they said they were going to do and they're effective. And then I've got this triangulation and this tension in the business that we're doing what we said we're going to do. It's adequately resourced. And that means I can rely upon that in addition to what I'm actually observing in the business too. So to me, it's a very, we're very early in this space. And that was also one of the things, and we're doing a lot of good work. And by the way, that was one of the myths that came out of the Gibson case, is around if you're a good person doing a lot of good work, that will not save you. And I think there was this perception of, if I'm doing a lot of things, that I'm building the ledger up. And this case destroyed that. It really wasn't around how thin you were spreading yourself, but it was around, are you focusing in those key areas? So that was another good learning out of the case. So, but yeah, to me, it's definitely it is a moving feast. But again, I think it's around setting up, how do you set up people to work together, not just around relying upon one function, one expert, or one worldview.
And looking at, I guess, the control of the hazard rather than focusing purely on outcome metrics, right?
Exactly. And that's the point, like we've made, is around, and that's why I say, like, you got to worm your way through the board paper. It's like the finances up the front, you've seen which business units are not meeting. You've then got the back where the turnover is. And then you're like, well, and then you're seeing, complaints, then you're seeing workers' comp, and you're seeing it all together. But the key thing you got to think in mind is around what happens first, and then what's the causality chain. And then you've got to apply that and overlay it with the exposure. So to me, that's the hard part of being a director, is that, you tend to know the financial space, that if I'm not selling something, I can't book profit. So therefore I know where to intervene. And this is the point that I think directors and officers are still building the causal chain in their brains, and they're still understanding where can I allocate resources to prevent this. And I think we've done a heap of work in awareness. We've done a heap of work in training. We're doing a heap of work in reporting systems and survey systems. And now it's the case as to pulling it all together so that people go, hey, I'm not having any death by suicides. I'm okay. No. I've actually allocated resources here, and here, and my span of control is good. I know the capability in my business. We're able to withstand shocks, and I'm comfortable, and I go to sleep well at night knowing that if there is an extreme case, or if there is something exposure outside of the curve, the system will respond well to that. But it's also recognizing that sometimes, it's very hard, but sometimes, the system won't respond to the level that's needed. And that's hard too. And that's the other thing you have to live with, is around the test is it's a reasonable test. It's not you can prevent everything that happens. And I think that's another thing that tension is really hard in this space.
Yeah, it's so insightful, Wade. I know our listeners are going to really enjoy this conversation. One of the last questions I want to ask you is, when a CEO asks how to know whether they are discharging psychosocial due diligence right now, what are the 3 tests you'd give them?
Yeah, so to me, it's the information flow test. So in their brain, have they understood how the causal chain works? and not outsource that to just saying to people in culture or WHS, is it working as it needed? And I've got no complaints, so therefore it's good. So to me, is the information flow working, not am I not receiving a report. I think the other one is when, and this was there was a recent case of the Star case in Australia, was around, what information is coming through to you, what is potentially being guarded from you, and what do you need to drop in, and how are you making sure that when you get something, if every paper you get it's all good and you're getting green, that's a scary place to be, because it's being filtered and you got some rose-colored glasses if you're believing everything that comes to you. So, when was the last time that you got told something was insufficient? And if you're not getting told that, or you're not getting asked for more resources, maybe you have then a process of non-psychological safety in your team or the people reporting to you that they're comfortable to come to you and say that. And then to the point as to how far do you push to get a no? And so often there's an expectation from an outcome measurement that, something needs to be done, but it's around saying, well, we may need to trim costs by 5%, come back to me with how you're going to do it. But it might be a case of, hey, I need you to trim costs by 5%. Please come back to me next week with avenues we can progress, but I don't want you to impinge upon ABC. So giving some better guidance for people as to say, well, okay, I want A, but please don't do B or C. And then how does that all connect together? And then if someone come back to you and pushes on you and says, look, I actually can't do A because B and C will be affected, I can't see how I can do that. Well, then as someone else, you can go, well, hey, here's some resources to think of a different way of doing it. But also, when was the last time you went, okay, you can't do 5. What else can we do? So what is that guiding line as to that? So, and that's the trade-offs you make. And they're hard conversations, but also when you're operating across a bigger scale, they're conversations that need to be had. So often there's a case where we do risk assessments post the decision. And it's a case, well, how do you have a risk as part of the upfront process as to work that through? So, yeah, so to me, it's a really interesting one. But also, and look, I sometimes have the stupid grin on my face, and whilst I appreciate, it's actually real harm that occurs from these decisions. But I'm interested, and I have that stupid grin on my face because I think there's so much upside for people to connect this together. And once people have connected it in their head, they actually see the causal chain, and they can change the way they act and then prevent that impact. So to me, it's giving more people cards rather than doing more checks. It's actually getting people to allocate resources better and to lead better, not just around more training courses.
Yeah, absolutely. I really hear you when you talk about the what type of information are you getting? Is it all good news versus bad news? And that was part of the Gibson case as well, right? Like, how do you assess the quality of data that you're receiving? And that seems like a really important skill for executives and board members to have.
Yeah, and look, it's often as board members you get an audit, right? But you don't tend to interrogate what was the terms of reference, and the terms of reference dictate often the output you get. And so even just around like an ISO 45003 audit, that's fantastic, but is that giving me the information I need to discharge my duty? And why can't I as a director push back and go, actually, the terms of reference, when it comes through a committee, ISO 45003 is fantastic, but what I'd really like is, can someone do an overlay for me to make sure that from a due diligence perspective, the key areas within that audit are weighted more heavily rather than every criterion is worth 1 point. And people don't get it. People don't get that you can go to an auditor and say, please, let's have an open dialogue about this. Now, unless it is a pure commercial requirement from a customer, but even if it is a commercial requirement from a customer, you can talk to the auditor and say, hey, I'd like you to look at X, Y, Z. Can we have that as external to the audit? But I still want that information because I need that information to come. Because supply chain partners and customers are now tweaking to, if everything's all green and the industry's still got a problem, it's my process that is an issue. I can't outsource my due diligence to the SMETA audit, for example. I need to go and look as well, because it's generic is only as good as what we give it and the weighting we give it. So to me, yeah, I mean, I'm actually, I'm very optimistic around everything is pulling towards, from prosecution's perspective, regulators are now bringing more cases, investors are more interested than they've ever been, governments are now, through workers' compensation insurance schemes, being really hard to fund and being unfundable in a lot of the times because, all that is coming together, which pressure then allows us to then respond and potentially be better. So yes, it's hard. Yes, at the moment there's a lot of thing, and yeah, a lot of directors are saying, "Geez, I don't want to be a director anymore because there's so much risk." But guess what? You can shape the board papers. You can shape the conversation. So to me, pressure allows agency to come back into the conversation and to stop the rolling forward of, "Oh, we've always reported it like that."
So someone listening to this episode today, what would you want them to stop doing tomorrow morning as a result of what they've heard, and what should their system stop doing?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to think through. We've got to stop using things that were designed for another purpose that we have then grabbed hold of and use it. So, for example, in WHS, it's like TRIFA was a measure of safety. No, it's a measure of loss, right? Okay. Same thing with, engagement scores, right? You have to design the better process. So put it down and don't extrapolate what it could be unless you've done the work to enable it to be reflective. So, and that's where, in effect, if you're trying to do safety well, you have to understand the different exposures that exist, and fatal risk is very different to rolled ankles and the causal chains between the two. So the energy that's involved. And I think that's the level that we've got to stop saying this psychosocial word. It doesn't make sense. It has sub components to that. It has its own hazard language. And when I hear the person say psychosocial risk, in my head, it's the same as saying physical safety. No one says physical safety. No one does it. If you want a better conversation, you have to be better in your language. And if you can't be more technical in your language, you have to use language to connect with other people to get them to do things. So you have to start from their baseline. So we have to stop doing that. So yeah, to me, is stop presenting information that causally you think could work and it doesn't, and it's been proven. So Hopkins back in '94 was saying TRIFA doesn't prevent fatalities and serious incidents. So to me, there's not a knowledge gap here; it's an execution gap, and we need more executors, not more thinkers. Because thinking, we're so far ahead and we're not doing it, and I think that's a good one. The other one is around the system layer. And to me, from what we're doing, and I look across the ditch in New Zealand, I'm like, wow, great judgment that came out. They've also got the health and safety governance, a good practice guide. I mean, Chris Jones was involved in that. There was a heap of people that were involved. They've got a business community that, is really supportive of health and safety, the CEO forum. I mean, I'm looking at that going, wow, I wish we had more of that in Australia. And I wish we had a document that could be given to directors and bridge the gap between directors, officers, and safety personnel and people and culture personnel that actually can have a really good aligned conversation on this that is not just compliance focused, but is both compliance, performance, and productivity focused. And that would be such a fantastic bridge between everybody. That good business can be good for people, and can be good for the broader economy and productivity. So that to me is around how can more people connect and get that on board. So stretching out and getting out of your silo and getting into people and having respectful conversations and challenging people, but at the same time, recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Excellent advice as always, Wade. So Wade, this brings us to the end of the podcast. Before we go into our standard couple of questions to finish up, is there any other thoughts that you feel like you missed that you'd want to share with our listeners? Or is that your summary?
I'm very cautious of hope. I'm wary of hope because hope as a strategy got us into awareness, and that's important, and that's really good. But I think one of the inertias that I see in acting in this space is that everyone measures themselves as to what the best at the moment could be. And so I've spoken a heap about that right today as to what could better look like. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are thinking, I could never implement that sort of stuff. And that's not in every business that I'm involved in. You have to start where the business is at and just get them to take a step forward. And it's not a reflection on you to work in a less mature business or a less mature industry. And because that step is sometimes more valuable than taking a big step in a high hazard industry. So to me, I think we're also maybe suffering from comparing ourselves to what's unachievable where our current situation is. And that creates inertia. So that's the only thing to me is to you're only as good as how fast you can move the current business you're in, and that's going to take different things. So if you can only get mental health awareness training through, that's not a bad thing. And I mean, I've even bashed it a little bit as part of this, but it's not bashing it as in don't do it. It's take the step you can at the point in time, but leaving the door open as the business and leaders mature to take the next step. So like I think that as well, and I'm guilty of it. So like, you know, it's one thing to say something, but to work in businesses and you're building towards something. So I think I think we've all got to be a little bit kind to ourselves and also respect the people that we're working with, not to. That's my only reflection, that, you know, it's great. It's great to talk theoretical, but it's also even better to get someone to do something. And when you leave, they keep doing it.
Yeah, and you learn, right? Like you said, you look back at what you were writing 5-10 years ago, and your thinking's changed, and you've like kind of matured or had different insights now that kind of guide what you think, and that's definitely the case for us as well. And what you're saying there regarding meeting the organisation where it's at, helping them to take those first initial steps can be just as important as taking those big, massive steps later on. But you need to get out of that inertia, right, and build that momentum to, you know, continue on a path of continuous improvement, right? So we always, I guess the first customers we dealt with were the more mature ones, right? And we would give them very robust processes to go through. But now we do e-learning, right, which we always kind of poo-pooed. But hey, it's a foot in the door. Let's give them some base level education, get a taste for this stuff so that they're ready to take the next step when they're ready.
Yeah, and I think that's beautiful, right? It's great because you're respecting the person you're working with to give them what they need at the point in time, but also giving them a runway as to, hey, when you're ready, there's all this other stuff to look at. So, like, yeah, I dislike the prosecution should motivate people. I think it always should be, what does the business want to generate? And sometimes I think that, you know, directors are very focused on compliance, as they should be, for personal risk reasons. But, you know, I think there's a lot of good people doing a lot of good things, and getting out of your silo and just getting a step forward is fantastic, and that's brilliant. And people should focus on the next step rather than keep educating themselves as to what the best step is.
Yeah, because it just gets them in that paralysis moment, doesn't it? Oh, it's too hard. Like if you dream too big and think about something that's totally unachievable, it doesn't get you anywhere in the end. So
no, and you can sit there for years designing great audit tools between 4 different codes of practice, between 3 different jurisdictions, and then you actually do the audit. But you have in the time taken to design the audit, there was then all those weeks of exposure where nothing changed. And so that's the other thing that I think it's really, I think with large language models and a lot of this, you know, that sort of conceptual thought and that ability for multiple people in a country and globally to do this work will drop very quickly, and we'll get great guides now, because it doesn't mean everyone has to meet and agree and do all that. You know, use those for those, but it will never stop the executing that needs to be done. It will never stop the education piece and the literacy and working with people as to what better looks like and having those trade-off decisions. Large language models can't do that. So to me, like I'm very optimistic, but you know, wary of hoping where unless execution occurs, nothing changes.
Okay, well, I won't, because I think you've answered the question, so I'm not going to ask you about what your hopes for the future of workplace mental health are, because I think you've kind of summed it up there, right? It's about taking the next step, not the biggest step, and it's about execution, not planning.
Very much.
Yeah.
All right, last question for you, Wade. Words of advice for listeners who want to work in this area.
Huge. I find the more conversations I have and the more people want to work in this space. And I think they're coming from every single angle, from counselling, from psychology, through to finance, through to sustainability. So yeah, anyone that wants to work in this space, I think the good feedback I would have is around being really clear on what drives businesses and what makes businesses work. And often people are coming from their experience or theoretical base, and then they're applying that, and they don't take the time to understand capital flows, budgeting, profits, you know, business reporting cycles, budgeting, political pressures, all of those sort of things. And I find often a lot of the conversations I have is that's the gap. So to me, if you want to have a bigger impact, you have to understand business, you have to understand pressures on organizations, and then what are those pressures that hit each of those key stakeholders, either at the very top at a board, at a C-suite, at a next level down, at right down to team leader. So to me, if you want to get into this space and you want to be effective, it's about doing the niche training, learning, research if you're in that space, but then having a broader understanding of the context. And that's why I loved 45,003. It came in and it is all about what is the organizational context you're working within. And a lot of people skip that section and it becomes a very quick tick for an auditor. So to me, context is critical, and you can have all the right answers. And if you can't connect in with people that are having different pressures placed upon them, you will be sidelined very quickly, even if you're right.
Good advice, Wade, and probably a bit more unique than a lot of the other types of advice that guests have. So I'm sure that lots of listeners will find that one helpful.
But how many people sit in a budget room? How many people go, you know what, I have got a PhD, or I've got a master's, or I've got an undergraduate degree, or I've got a certificate in counselling, and I'm in my space. And then they go, you know what, I actually need to go sit in a budget meeting for a department. I need to understand how span of control actually gets resourced. They know what the concept of span of control is, but how is it determined in a business? What is the drivers of how span of control is actually created and what affects it? That's the conversation that needs to be had, and how you influence those factors, not by telling someone this is the ideal span of control. Why are you outside of your span of control? It's the financial model that dictates the span of control, and that's the influence you've got to know to really get past, to get into, to really get your hands dirty. So that to me is like, it's fundamental. When you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't unsee it. It's like talking two different languages.
Yeah, you need to understand that to be able to speak the right language to make the change that needs to occur.
Yeah, you can drive a car, but if you want to be a Formula One racer, you need to understand, how the car is designed. You need to understand the mechanics. You need to understand the economic models of Formula One as to being the best driver you can. Why is the F1 changing the design of the car? Why are they doing that? You need to understand that so you can get ahead of that to understand, well, okay, what skills do I need to develop, like battery harvesting? They changed the whole game. That's no different to what legislation does, policy work, and what supply chains do. So to me, it's that context that makes you so much better in your role. And it really allows you to go from maybe 10% or 15% of what you can do to well past 100 and to do really great work.
Well, Wade, always a very high intellectual discussion with you. Really appreciate you being so generous with your time and sharing out with the community your thoughts.
I did just say sit in a budget room. I don't think that's too intellectual, I'll be honest. I think most people is like drawing nails down a chalkboard budget meeting. So, but yeah.
Yeah, but sit in a budget meeting to seek to understand, right? Like yeah. But yeah, really appreciate your friendship, mate, and your willingness to come on this podcast. In another couple of years, we'll have you on again, hopefully, to talk about something else related and seeing how your thinking has, again, evolved and changed. So,
yeah, I won't be wrong. I'll just be better. Hopefully a little bit more right.
Yeah.
A little bit more right, hopefully, is there. So, yeah.
So thanks again, mate.
Beautiful. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
So listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do record these over video when we have our guests on, and you can catch all of our previous videos, more than 200 in fact, on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. You'll also find the best of these conversations, the little clips on Flourish DX LinkedIn page. So follow along there if you're not already. And while you're on LinkedIn, you can feel free to connect with Joelle, myself, or Wade if you want to continue the conversation. But that's it for today, and we'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety podcast at www.psychhealthandsafety.com.